Tom Lake, and I should have the official title of his talk. After the Ice Age, Life Returns to Orange County. Tom Lake from the New York State Department of Conservation, Hudson River Estuary Specialist.
Thank you, Peter. Before we turn the lights off, because I think we'll have to do that. Can everybody hear me? If anybody needs me to talk up, I will. Everybody see everything? See okay? I just want to make a quick mention about Linda's points here. Matter of fact, poignant fact, there's only a few in here that are actually arrowheads. One of the things, one of the misnomers or misclassifications of stone tools is that everything that's sharp, pointed, and looks like it would go on something would be an arrowhead. The bow and arrow only came to Orange County about AD 750, AD 800. Before that, the bow and arrow was, nobody knew what a bow and arrow was. It came from the Midwest. It was sort of an invention by necessity. If you were a Plains Indian and you were hunting bison, you couldn't run up next to them and stick them. You had to shoot them at a distance. So the bow and arrow sort of became something that was needed, and it was developed, and then eventually came here to the east. There's only a few in here. These little small triangles are arrowheads. The rest are all spear points. Spear points or dart points that were put on darts that were as much as 3 and 4 feet long and thrown with a tool called an atlatl. So you could kill at a distance supposedly with that too, although how accurate I'm not sure. But this range of Linda's points here, some of these are 7,000 years old, and some of the newer ones, the actual arrowheads could be 500 years old, something like that. So when you look at this display right here done by Linda's father, this is in fact a glimpse of the prehistory of the Hudson Valley, the prehistory of the Hudson Valley. We're going to talk about that now. This is in fact a history conference, and if you think about it, the word history is a Eurocentric concept. When Europeans came to this country with a chip on their shoulder, they looked around and they said, all these people living here, they have no idea who they are. They don't know their history. They really came here with a bias towards the native people living here. When the first Europeans arrived here in the 16th century and the 17th century, over more than 400 generations of people had been living in Orange County. More than 400. A couple of years ago, we celebrated the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson coming up the Hudson River. And whenever I had the opportunity, I would, even though I worked for the state and I had to watch what I said because it was their conference or their celebration, I would tell people 400 years is nothing. Native people lived here for 12,000 years. So you can't discount that. You know, the state was saying things like, you know, Henry Hudson brought God to the Hudson Valley. He brought a civilization to the Hudson Valley. You know, if you were a native person, you didn't like those particular attitudes towards people. So this idea of history is one that kind of goes along with this idea that people began to write things down. Now, writing is another kind of a very subjective talent. Certainly, certain Native Americans in the Americas had ways through hieroglyphics and other things of recording their history. Most Native people, though, told stories. They remembered their stories. They knew who they were because they had people within their communities whose job it was to save and keep the stories of their people. So all of their history was there, but it was in their minds. It was in their heads, and they passed it on generation to generation. To Europeans, this was a concept of, I can't remember anything, I got to write it down. Native people didn't do that. It was a different worldview. So history conference, we have to remember there is an attachment to that which deals with prehistory. And that's what I'm going to talk about here today, prehistory. This is the first of 3 presentations today that will deal with this gentleman right up here. This, actually, that's a female. This particular extinct form of elephant that was living here in Orange County probably from about 15 or 16,000 years ago until they went extinct, and we'll talk about that as well. The other 2 presentations will be later today by Mr. Joe Devine and Evan Galbraith, and collectively we're talking about the life, the death, the discovery or rediscovery, and the future of what we know about these animals. And these animals share the landscape with the first people that came here. By the time Europeans showed up and people started writing things down, these animals had passed away. They no longer were here. But certainly the first people that were here did in fact see some of these animals. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to go through and take you on a bit of a journey that's going to last about 20,000 years. But it only takes 40 minutes. It's all quick, all right? If you have questions, the best solution to that probably is to wait to the end, and then I'll leave some time at the end when we can do some questions and answers on that. Okay, you can turn off the lights now, or whatever is necessary. I'm going to turn this around so I can see if I can. Okay. Life in Orange County, to the best of the knowledge of most scientists, is very deep time. It goes back maybe 200 million years, perhaps more than that. It goes back more than that, but as far as evidence that we can go out on the landscape and see, maybe 200 million years ago, when continents were closer together, Orange County was probably located closer to the equator. Things were different. It wasn't the Orange County that we know today. It was more tropical. Different species of animals lived here. Probably none of those species are still around here today. So there's a lot of deep time when it comes to Orange County. This little guy was scampering around the Orange County landscape millions of years ago. Clovis, one of the most famous of primitive, I shouldn't use that word, early forms of reptilian life were in Orange County. Clovis is one of probably the most famous, we can use the word dinosaur, in New York State. We're going to fast forward millions of years, see how we're going to do this now, right? So about 21,000 years ago. 21,000 years ago, we were in the throes of an ice age. The ice over Orange County was as much as 10,000 feet thick. And from that, we can assume that no one was home. There may have been some seabirds, there may have been some species of birds who came to Orange County to nest on top of this incredible glacier to avoid predation, Arctic fox, things such as that. Now this idea of ice age is an interesting one. We have had, over the last 2 million years, by all accounts, 8 ice ages. And they're one of these things that we don't know a whole lot about. Scientists do not really know why ice ages begin. They think that some small change in the way the Earth rotates on its axis, or the way it revolves around the sun, is just small enough so that winter lingers longer and summer is much shorter. And that produces an accumulation of snow and ice at the poles. And over time, the ice begins to creep towards the equator globally, and we have an ice age. And then, within usually about 20,000 years or so, maybe sometimes less, sometimes more, whatever that little change was, changes back. And suddenly winter becomes shorter, summer becomes longer, and we go back into what we call interglacial periods, when things are kind of like they are right now. We're in a period right now that's getting a little confusing because this is the first of these interglacial periods that we have been around for the most part, at least burning fossil fuels. And so another complication has been added to it. We may well be disrupting this cycle of ice ages and interglacial periods. We don't really know. Scientists, there's a lot we don't know about this stuff. 20,000 years ago, there was a lot of ice. There we go. Now this idea, I threw a word out there called the Pleistocene. Deep time on Earth and in Orange County is so vast and so deep that scientists have to take that incredible amount of time and break it up into smaller fragments so they can get their arms around it and they can think about it and they can do comparing and contrasting at times. So there are these eras that divide up deep time. One of them is called the Pleistocene. You see it there in yellow. And it was from about 1.8 to 2 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago. It's one of the most important, if not the most important period in the prehistory of the Earth as far as our species is concerned. It was a time of a lot of environmental stress here on planet Earth. A lot of volcanoes, a lot of earthquakes, the continents were moving around, and our species came out of that tumult. We had to either adapt to new environments or we would go extinct. Our primate ancestors had to either adapt or go extinct. And about 180 to 200,000 years ago, we emerged from Africa as an adaptation to all these changes that were going on the Earth at that time. So the Pleistocene is a very, very important period of time. Back to the Ice Age here, the one that was in Orange County about 20,000 years or so ago. Huge, huge glacier. And it moved across the landscape from northeast to southwest. And you can go out in Orange County and find large areas where there's exposed bedrock. And if you look, if you're fortunate, you find the right place, you'll find grooves in the rock that were made by this huge glacier that was traveling over the land. These glaciers were incredible. Besides being 10,000 feet thick, The belly of the glacier was often quite wet. It was melting. But buried in the bellies of these glaciers were rocks the size of school buses. And they worked like diamond cutters, and they cut grooves in the glacial rocks. So you can actually see the glacial grooves or glacial striation. These huge rocks that acted as like diamond cutters, you've all seen them. If you've been driving around Orange County and you drive by some farmland, you look out in the middle of a field, and here's this huge rock out there, the size of J.C. Penney's. Well, how did that ever get out there? It's out in the middle of a field. It was dropped there by the glacier when the glacier melted. That rock might have come from New Brunswick, and it was carried down here by the glacier. The glacier melted, dropped it in place, and now it's out in the middle of somebody's field. You know, and of course people start stories about aliens brought it here, and all this, Vikings brought it with them. All these kind of stories, when in fact it is a natural occurrence of what happens. Believe me, I hear all the stories. Ice covered most of North America. Ours was called the Laurentide ice sheet. The Cordilleran ice sheet was out to the west. Europe had a similar type of glaciation, very, very thick ice. But you can see where it covered all of our area. It covered all of our area. In a way, it's good, because when I teach prehistory, I'm an anthropologist, and when I teach the prehistory of the Hudson Valley, there's really a starting point. 20,000 years ago, I can assume fairly accurately that nobody was here. And so that's a beginning point when you start to talk about life that was here in the Hudson Valley. Somewhere around 18,000 years ago, it got warmer. Maybe not that warm, but it got warmer, all right? So the ice began to melt. And, glaciers carry an incredible amount of sediments with them. Things from the size of grains of sand all the way to these rocks the size of school buses. And when the glaciers melt, we have this idea of glaciers retreating. They simply melt. It gives the impression that they're receding, but they're actually just melting in place and they're backing up. All of that sediment, all those rocks and school buses they were carrying, all get left in place. And very often, at the very edge of the glacier, it forms a barrier. It forms a glacial dam, a moraine dam, we call it. If you go across the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, that at one time was a solid moraine dam between Staten Island and Brooklyn. And so when all this water melted, it couldn't get out of the Hudson Valley. It was stored up, and we had tremendous glacial lakes here. This area right here, 15,000 years ago, 16,000 years ago, we would have had probably 100 feet of water over our heads. This would have been a glacial lake. The water was here, and it couldn't get out to the sea. The Hudson River, the proto-Hudson River, had Glacial Lake Hudson, Glacial Lake Iroquois, Glacial Lake Albany. Glacial Lake Iroquois was actually the Mohawk River. But all this water was pent up in New York State. It couldn't get out. Eventually, over time, it did. We think the Verrazano Narrows broke through somewhere around 12,500 to 13,000 years ago. And there may have been people here at that time. I always envision people on Staten Island standing there the day that dam broke, and there was this tremendous whoosh. A biblical story of a flood probably came out of that that's been now lost. It must have been an incredible event to see when that finally broke. But we had these tremendous glacial lakes. Now, at this point in the Hudson Valley, when we had these glacial lakes, 15,000 years ago, this area was ice-free. And we keep looking for when the first people came to Orange County. And that's an elusive target. We have a lot of possibilities of when the first people came to Orange County. Probably not too many anthropologists or archaeologists firmly agree on one particular time period. One of the problems with the first people to come to Orange County is the habitat. Because there were people at this time, 15,000 years ago, there were people living in Tennessee, and Ohio, and West Virginia, and so on, to the south of here. But they weren't coming up into the Hudson Valley because there was not a support system for them here. There were no deciduous trees. This was part tundra. There were a lot of coniferous trees, a lot of conifer forests, spruce, hemlock, and others were here in this area, and that's not conducive to the support of human life. There's not much in the coniferous forest to support a family. It wasn't until the first oak trees came, the first hickory trees, nut-bearing trees, or deciduous trees arrived here in the Hudson Valley that people began to think about actually coming here and living. Of course, that corresponded with a lessening of the climate. It began to get a little bit warmer around here at that time. But because once you get a tree, a nut-bearing tree, now you get white-tailed deer. Now you get squirrels and chipmunks and all those other things that go along with that. Now you've got an all-night deli out there that humans can come and live here, and they feel they can support themselves. So people may have taken hunting forays into the Hudson Valley 14,000 years ago. There's not a lot of evidence of that, but they could have. But they certainly did not stay here for very long because there was not much here to support them. But by about 15,000 years ago, you see that about sign up there before the 15? Archaeologists have to use that a lot. And, you know, some people would say that we use weasel words a lot. We never kind of like really say this is for sure. In the world of science, most areas of science, a lot of the stuff is maybe, because we don't know. Everything you'll hear today is good for today, but tomorrow you may read in the New York Times or read online that some discovery's been made that'll make most of what I'm saying today invalid. Okay? And people, you know, who want to become anthropologists, archaeologists, paleontologists, most of the scientific biologists, you have to be able to live in a world of uncertainty, because what you think you know today, you may find out tomorrow you really didn't know. So when I say 15,000 years ago, we may find evidence at a next excavation we're working on tomorrow that tells us that the ice wasn't free until 14,000 years ago. But that's our best guess right now. So when it looks like anthropologists and archaeologists are kind of like hedging their bets, we are, because we don't really know. This is the Hudson River watershed. Once the ice is gone, we had this Hudson River watershed, which you may hear this term a lot, the idea of a watershed. The Hudson River watershed includes the Mohawk River Valley, a little bit of Vermont, a little bit of Massachusetts down here, a little bit of Connecticut over in here, a little bit of northern New Jersey. We're in this area right here. And all this means is that the heights of ground all around here is such that when water falls here, it comes to the Hudson River. Water falling anywhere outside goes to the St. Lawrence River, goes to the Delaware River, goes to the Susquehanna River, goes to the Housatonic River, the Connecticut River, and so on. So this is the watershed. And watersheds are defined by where water goes when it falls on the ground. We're part of the Wallkill River watershed, which is also part of the Hudson River watershed. As Dr. Feynman was saying, I do a lot of archaeology in Orange County, and I've done a lot of archaeology around here, a lot of it, especially over in the Blackbeard area. And it's one of my favorite places to do that kind of work because it's still rural, or semi-rural at least. A lot of the places I work in the Hudson Valley are very urban, and you have to dig your way through human garbage to get to the good stuff. Here in Orange County, particularly this area of Orange County, the remnants of past civilizations is just right there in the ground, and you don't have to necessarily dig through a lot of stuff that people have left behind. It's kind of nice. Okay, so about 15,000 years ago, life returned to the Hudson Valley. This is a wonderful drawing by a guy named Charles Knight. You can sit and look at this thing all day. Well, at least I can sit and look at it all day. These are some of the animals that came back. Some of these came to Orange County. Probably most of them did. You've got the woolly mammoth right here. You've got the mastodon right here. This is an extinct form of bison called Bison antiquus. You've got a giant beaver down here. This guy here is Smilodon, or saber-toothed tiger. Those were in northern New Jersey, and I don't know if there's any record of them ever being in New York State, but we'll say they snuck across the border one night when nobody's looking. Here's a musk ox right here. Anybody know what this guy is up here? Flying around? No, not an eagle. It's a big bird, though. It's the size of an eagle. In fact, bigger than the size of an eagle. It's a condor. Absolutely. This is a California condor. We didn't know, California condors, California, right? No, that's a name that we give them, right? We excavated one of those mastodons over in Duchess County about 10 years ago. And because it took us 13 months to get everything out of the ground, actually find it and get everything out of the ground, we had a lot of time to go around looking at bones of other things that were there. We found some bird bones that just didn't match anything we knew. We took it to the New York State Museum, looked at their comparative zoological collection for birds. We said, wow, this is a condor. At that point, we knew that there were condors, at least in Duchess County. Since then, we have found other condor bones elsewhere in New York State. So, 15,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, California condors, these huge scavenger birds. They're not raptors, they're scavenger birds. We're living here in the east, and particularly in Orange County. So these are some of the animals that were coming back. There's a mix there of deciduous trees as well as conifers. And in the Hudson Valley, they shared the landscape with these guys right here. These are families of mastodons. Now, these are an extinct form of elephant. Mammoths are an extinct form of elephant. I use the word elephant, and if I were writing it down, I'd probably put quotes around it, because even though they're related to elephants, there are many a lot of biologists who would say they're not technically an elephant, but they really are. They're close enough related so we can talk to them about them as being elephants. nobody has ever told us the stories of what the mastodons and mammoths were like, even though the native people seen them. Those stories have been lost, and of course nobody wrote anything down. So we have to assume what the behavior of these animals were. So when I say families of mastodons, some 10 feet high, weighing 10,000 pounds, wandering Orange County, that's based on the idea that modern-day elephants form very, very concise and very formal social units, usually families and extended families. There's every reason to believe, from the evidence we have found of mammoths and mastodons in Orange County, that they also, because of their close relationship to modern-day elephants, that they did in fact have these very, very close social units. All of the physiology of these elephants, all of the echo chambers in their heads and their ability to communicate, they were able to communicate at a very high-pitched frequency for long distances with very specific levels of frequency, so that people in their members of their family would recognize they were being called to dinner, say, or something like that. Very, very sophisticated stuff. Modern elephants are just incredibly sophisticated when it comes to that kind of thing, and we suspect that these elephants were as well. But it's really neat to be able to think about these herds of elephants walking around the Orange County landscape. This is the taxonomy. By taxonomy, we mean what's the scientific classification. Scientists, really need to do this kind of thing because we do a lot of comparing. We do comparing extinct elephants with modern elephants, different kinds of fishes and birds, and so on. So you really have to put a framework around life on Earth in order to give it some sense from a scientific perspective. Their order is Proboscidea. They're mammals. This is their family right here. Here's their genus, and this is their species. Okay, so that's the pedigree of mastodons who lived here. Now, the reason I'm talking mostly about mastodons and not mammoths, those are the two kinds of elephants. We'll talk about those. Is because the interior of Orange County, when those animals were here, was a type of habitat that drew mastodons, but not necessarily mammoths. And that's why we're mostly talking about mastodons here. And the other two presentations today will be about these guys as well. We think they came to North America about 5 million years ago. There's evidence they've been here about 5 million years. Actual remains of mastodons have been found from Alaska to Florida. Most of them date back to about 300,000 years ago. And they lived in spruce forests out on the continental shelf at one time. So they have been here for a while. They're not native to North America, however. This is the mastodon tooth. Now this is the key to this particular form of elephant. George Cuvier, being French of course, saw the cusps on their teeth as breasts. Thus, if you go through the Latin and Greek of the name mastodon, you see mastos meaning breast and andonto meaning tooth, so breast tooth. I have one up here today. This is one of the 2, 4, 6, 8 teeth in a mastodon. This was a young mastodon. And you can see that there are, I'll hold up, you can actually see these cusps. They have teeth like a white-tailed deer, in that they are browsers. We've had white-tailed deer problem in the winter. Sometimes they'll come around and eat everything green in your yard, even things that aren't green. Well, it was worse 15,000 years ago. You'd have lost everything in your yard to these guys because they were browsing 10 times like white-tailed deer. But these have got those kinds of teeth. So the habitat, these guys are going to be in a habitat where there's good browsing. And that, in fact, was Orange County in prehistory. This is the Wallkill River Watershed. Let me see if I can move this out of the way so I haven't got to keep walking in front of the screen. I can. And nothing fell. Good. This is the Wallkill River Watershed. To give you an idea of where we are, here's Newburgh, here's Middletown, and we're down in this area here. Again, everything falls into the Wallkill River within this yellow area. You got the Passaic River and so on down in this area here. And it flows north, meets the Rondout Creek, and comes into the Hudson River up here in Kingston. I put that on there because of all the places I have excavated in the Northeast, the Southwest, and in South America, and my favorite place on the world, and within the confines of those places, is here in the Wallkill River Valley. It's where I find the best preservation of the past here. In other places, I don't find nearly as good preservation. Now, one of my very favorite places to go, and you're all familiar with this, if we all got in a bus right now, we could probably be there in about 5 minutes, is the Black Dirt region of Orange County, 35 square miles, and mastodons have been found in and around this area. Now, in the true spirit of ecology, we try not to single out one species of animal and talk about them like they were living all by themselves. The Black Dirt area, Warwick, Orange County, mastodons shared the landscape with a whole lot of other kinds of animals. There were some mammoths around. Not that many. I have a mammoth tooth up here as well. I'll show you a slide in just a few minutes from now. But mammoths had teeth. I'll show you a better picture in a moment. They have a very flat surface area on their tooth. And if you put another one above that and put them together, you can see these guys were grazers. They like grasslands. This one's in a grassland right here. This guy's out in the continental shelf. They like grasslands. When we look at what Orange County looked like 12, 13,000 years ago, not a lot of grasslands. You might wonder, how do we know what Orange County looked like? Botanists are able to go into the earth and take samples of the earth down at a level that dates to 12,000 years ago. They look at the pollen, do a pollen analysis. And when they look at the types of plants that gave that pollen out, they find very, very little in the way of grasslands. And so the assumption is, just by the way the land looks, you can tell that it was mostly boggy, swampy, foresty, but not grasslands. Grasslands were more on the coast. So even though we did have some mammoths here, we did not have a lot of mammoths here. Here's the teeth again. Here are these cusps that are on a mastodon, which makes them a browser. These areas here on this mammoth tooth are for grinding, like a bovine, like a cow. All right. We make the habitat suitable for cows on farms, but if it was all forested here, people with cattle would not do very well. And other large animals were living here at that time. And if you are familiar with some of the finds that have been made here in the Black Dirt area of Orange County, the Wallkill River Valley, some of these are familiar. Here's our condor again up here. Here's a giant beaver here. It's a little blurry. I'm not sure what this guy is over here. It looks like my dog. It's not though. And this guy here is one of the most famous residents of the Black Dirt area, and he is called an elk moose. He is called an elk moose. This is an extinct form of animal. They had the body like a moose, and they had a rack like an elk. And they were around here, and they're one of those animals that are no longer here, and we'll get to that in a bit as to what happened to them. Here's the elk moose, or also called the stag moose. Here's a local gentleman from Pine Island, Richard Van Sickle. A couple of years ago, he's not the only one. This is usually every spring when plowing begins, something like this pops up. Here's a rack or a set of antlers from an elk moose, and that's 5.5 feet across, something like that. This particular elk moose probably was about 12,000 years old. And every spring, when planting begins here in the Black Dirt area, things like this pop up, as well as Linda's father's projectile points that we see in this glass case. These are called projectile points, by the way. We don't differentiate between arrowheads and spear points. We call them all projectile points. But those pop up in the dirt as well as these right here. And about 13,000 years ago, the first people arrived in Orange County. Now it's interesting that in all of New York State, we do not have any really, really old dates that we can really be firm about in terms of when the first people came to New York State. Right? Here in Orange County, here in the Warwick area, Duchess Quarry Caves, some of you may know where Duchess Quarry Caves is, just down the road 4 or 5 miles, I guess, is a site where radiocarbon dating done on the remains of fauna in the cave, not the oldest fauna in the cave. There have been some really old fauna, old animal remains in the cave that date to 13,000 years ago, but they're not in association with the first people. The first people are associated with some later remains that date about 5,000 years ago. But you'll notice up there I have calendar years ago, C-A-L, calendar years ago. If you like archaeology and you read about the prehistory of Orange County, or New York State for that matter, you will often read about dating, and you'll get this radiocarbon dating. It's a scientific method of dating organics, things that were once alive, Very accurate, very accurate. And it came in the advent of World War II, or I'm sorry, in the wake of World War II, a lot of scientific discoveries came out, and one of those was this idea of being able to date things. The problem, and radiocarbon dating worked really, really well for about 45 years or so, until one day somebody discovered that we had been doing this radiocarbon dating, and we had assumed carbon, radiocarbon, that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is a key element of this thing, has been consistent since 50,000 years ago until today. So when we're dating things, we can very accurately say if something's 12,000 years ago radiocarbon dated, it really is 12,000 years ago. You could get into, a time machine, go back 12,000 years, and there it would be. It's that accurate. But somebody suddenly realized, and I think they did it by looking at ice in the Arctic, where they went down to 12,000 years ago, measured the gases that were trapped in the Arctic ice, and they said, you know what? There was less carbon in the atmosphere 12,000 years ago. I think our dates are off. And sure enough, they are. And so archaeologists have had to go and recalibrate the way they look at things. So Duchess Quarry Caves, until fairly recently, was thought to be about 11,500 years ago. But if you went into a time machine and went back 11,500 years ago, what you were looking for wouldn't be there. You'd have to go back 13,000 years ago. Things are older than they actually appear. So Duchess Quarry Caves is about 13,000 years ago, and on the left is a projectile point of what was found in the caves. It was found in association with a woodland caribou that were here at that time. All right? And because they were in close enough association, scientists, archaeologists have been able to say there's probably a relationship between the two of them. On the right is my wife and my golden retriever. Okay. Of more recent vintage. Right? That point, by the way, is emblematic of the first people in Orange County. They're called, collectively, we call Clovis Points, with two quotes around it, because it's kind of a generic name. If you asked the Paleo-Indians back then, how are your Clovis Points doing, they would know what the heck you were talking about. It's a name that we give to things. We do that all the time because we have to have labels on things, right? These points, however, we believe date back, and they probably do, to 12,000 years ago, or 11,500, or even 12,000 years ago. Recent indications, though, nationally, across North America and South America, is that people were here perhaps long before these projectile points were being used. The problem, we have not been able to identify those cultures because they did not have an emblematic type of stone tool. I mean, now when we dig in the ground, when I dig out here in the Black Dirt area over here, I'm looking for these kind of projectile points. And if I find one of these, I can pretty well figure what I'm looking at in the ground is 12,000 years old, something like that, right? There may be older cultures that were here 2,000 years before that. They didn't have anything that you could put your finger on and say, that identifies them as 14,000 years ago. Makes it kind of sticky, But we think people were here before 12,000 years ago. They just didn't leave us any messages. No business cards, nothing. So we really don't know. This is the fluted point. It's emblematic of the first Americans. And that's kind of a nice one right there. They're all nice. Let me go back. How do I do that? All right. Actually, I won't. Just remember that slide that zipped by really, really quick. It was another projectile point. It was a Clovis point. It was we call it Barnes Point, actually. And it gives you an idea of how archaeologists are able to figure out what the first people who lived in Orange County, how they moved around the landscape. These were hunters and gatherers. They didn't have villages. They didn't domesticate plants. They lived off the land, and they were many times healthier than we are today. They did not overpopulate the land because mom and dad could have one child, and they couldn't have a second one until that child was able to walk. Because, mom had to carry the baby if it couldn't walk, and of course, mom had to carry all the family's possessions because dad had much more important things to do, right? So mom couldn't have two babies. Who's going to carry all? No, dad ain't going to do that. Come on. So they had a self-regulation way of keeping their population low, and it was healthy. They ate good foods off the land, lots of fruits and veggies, right? And probably a lot of meat too, but in moderation. So people traveled over the landscape, and the beautiful part of these hunters and gatherers that lived in Orange County, until about 3,000 years ago, that was the way of living in Orange County, was that they knew the land. They were connected to the land. The land meant something to them. It's where they were born. It's where their families lived. It's where they're going to go when they die. Everything was here. They didn't have this idea of these astral universes where their souls are going to go. They knew this was where Orange County was their everything. Yeah? And they were connected to the land. They knew where all the food was. They knew the game paths of game. They knew where the best fruit patches were. They knew where the maple sugar trees were to tap in the wintertime. They knew all of that. They were connected to the land. It's obvious to all of us that people today are not nearly that connected to what's going on. We really don't. We've lost all of that. We get out a computer and use virtual reality to see all these things that are out there rather than actually go and see them. You know? It's a little disturbing to see students getting involved too much in that and not actually getting out and actually getting out in the world and seeing what's actually out there. Anyway, so that particular projectile point was found in Orange County, up in this area right here, that projectile point. The interesting thing about it was the stone that it was made from. Now, we get pretty sophisticated, not myself in particular, but people who work for me, who know stones, know rocks. That person was able to take that particular stone that it was made out of and trace it to a quarry down here in northern New Jersey. So you have Upper Orange County is where it was found. Northern New Jersey is where the rock came from that made it. The style of the point was very, very precise. That style of point was first used and used almost exclusively up here in Western Ontario. So the migratory path during the seasons for those people was probably winter here, springtime move up the Hudson Valley as millions upon millions of fish and waterfowl were migrating north, head across the Mohawk River, hit Lake Ontario, and go up and spend the summer up here in Western Ontario. And then the fall, follow the migrating food, the fish, the birds, back down and spend the winter here. So by connecting these three dots, we have a pretty good idea of where these people, how they were using Orange County as kind of the hub of their seasonal movements throughout the Northeast. Kind of a nice thing. Now, it may all just be a story we made up because, I don't know, it's to the best of our knowledge. That's kind of what's happened. Something tells me I went by a couple here. Let me see. This is very sensitive. Let me see if I get this thing to go back. Let's see. There's no mouse on this thing, so I end up getting lost on this. We have someone who knows how to get back on this?
Arrows.
Oh, where? Is there an arrow somewhere? Oh. Oh, okay. Oh, good. We're okay. Thank you very much. Great. That was very nice. That was a good move. Okay. Now, I talked before about why these guys aren't here anymore, this idea of extinction. We've had these ice ages. At the end of the last ice age, apparently the change was very abrupt. We went from Arctic conditions here in Orange County. I mean, 10,000 feet of ice will produce Arctic conditions. Even if it was melting, the wind coming off of the melting ice was so extreme that probably no mammals could live in Orange County until about 18,000 years ago, maybe even more recent than that. It was brutal, 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 brutal. So what animals first came back to Orange County were these animals we call Ice Age animals. They were very fine-tuned for an Ice Age environment. They had all the bells and whistles to allow them to live in an Ice Age environment. A corollary to that was occurring over in Europe at this time with a subspecies of ourselves. We're Homo sapiens sapiens. We have a subspecies called Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were humans with a lot of bells and whistles that allowed them to live in an Ice Age environment. They had shorter, stockier bodies. They had probably a little more facial hair. They had enlarged nasal canals to allow the air to warm their body. Lots of things that our particular species coming out of Africa really didn't need. So Neanderthals, and we think they went extinct because they could not adapt to the changing environment. There may have been other factors as well, but that's one of them anyhow. Same thing happened here in Orange County. You had all of these animals, including the stag, moose, and others, that were finally adapted for an Ice Age environment. The Mastodon had small ears, stocky bodies, and we think they had a lot of body hair. That would have went very well with living in an Ice Age environment. Look at the size of his ears, all right? Think what modern elephants look like. Now, here's an elephant that had been living in sub-freezing temperatures 12 months of the year for its entire life. Now, all of a sudden, things are changing, and we think that this change occurred within 50 to 100 years. It wasn't like it was hundreds of years. We went from a very cold, frigid environment here in Orange County to moderating environment to a temperate environment to maybe like today within 100 years. It happened very, very quickly. And it may have something to do with the way the Gulf Stream was working, bringing different climate in here at that time. But it got very warm. So imagine yourself walking around downtown Warwick in July, and it's 100 degrees, and you've got a lot of fur on your body, you got a short, stocky body, and you've got small ears. All right? What's the small ears thing about? Well, this is probably what eventually did in these guys. I'm being very careful.
Too careful.
Arrow down.
Well, you got the arrows working now, so I got to keep using the arrows? Yeah. Okay. 1 second. Okay, gotcha. Okay. Modern elephants. Think of Dumbo the flying elephant. I remember when I was a kid reading that, I said, that elephants can't fly. Come on. I was a sharp little kid. But look at the elephants. Look at the ears on modern elephants here, right? This is an African elephant. Asian elephants also have fairly large ears. Elephants have, and we think the extinct elephants did too, 150 gallons of blood in their body. Now, modern elephants today live in very warm parts of the world. They have to cool themselves off. And so what they do is, they circulate their blood through those big ears. And the thousands of capillaries in their ears allow the heat to escape through their ears. That's how they stay cool. But if you are living in Warwick and it's 100 degrees and you've got small ears, you're probably not going to do too well. Now, it's not like they keeled over and died on Main Street down here. That's not what happened. But what happened was they were uncomfortable. And when you're uncomfortable, you don't feel like making little mastodons. And so little by little, the amount of young being produced were fewer and fewer and fewer. The population got smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they had an unsustainable level of population and they eventually went extinct. A lot of these types of factors, inability to adapt. Now, a lot of animals did adapt. The moose, for example, white-tailed deer, the smaller animals were able to adapt to this new environment. But some of the large ones, like mammoths and mastodons, they just could not make that adaptation, so they did not survive. Oh, okay. Yeah. With climate changes, and there were a lot of other things too. Fragmented ecosystems. If you're a mastodon and your favorite food is here in Warwick, and all of a sudden the climate changes and those foods are not here anymore, you're at a loss. Now you have to eat perhaps less nutritious foods, and that also caused problems. Disease, unable to make necessary adaptations. When we excavated, in fact, most of the mastodons are excavated, even the ones here in Orange County, but I was specifically remembering the one we did in Hyde Park about 10 years ago. As we got the bones out of the ground, we began looking at the bones, and there was a pathologist who was on our team, and he noticed in the joints there was pitting in the joints. And he said, I've seen that pitting before. And he thought about it, and thought about it, and thought about it. He said, that animal had tuberculosis. And so we went to look at other skeletons throughout New York State, particularly Orange County, maybe 100 of them that were found. And 3/4 of the mastodons that had been excavated in New York State, particularly Orange County, had pitting in their joints, tuberculosis. Now, does that mean it was an epidemic? What it means is that 12,000 years ago, it got warm, and these animals were not ready for that. They became stressed. Their immune system got compromised, and they contracted a disease that's always out there. TB is out there all the time. We have immunity to it because our resistance is built up so we don't contract it. At least most of the time we don't. It's kind of like AIDS. When someone gets AIDS, they don't die from AIDS. They die from pneumonia or something else. Their immune system is weakened. They pick up something they normally would not, and they end up dying. Right? That's what happens with these animals. Tuberculosis seemed to be something that was affecting a lot of these animals. And they became extinct by about 12,000 calendar years ago. This is one of the ribs. This is a rib of a mastodon. They had 36 of these, 18 on each side. These guys were 10 feet high at the shoulder and weighed 10,000 pounds. They were big, big, big animals. And some of the mammoths, like the Colombian mammoth, were even much bigger than that. Now, why, when we look across New York State, if you look into this, you'll discover that Orange County it's often been called the mastodon capital of the world. And why is that? If you look across the state, you'll find that the Wallkill River Valley in Orange County tends to favor preservation of animals. Other places in the state, for example, in New York State, in the Hudson Valley to the north of here, and even to the west or the east of here, oftentimes the soil is too acidic and bones just do not last. But the Wallkill River Valley, because it was very boggy back when these animals were going extinct, a lot of the animals were preserved. They were preserved in strata that looked something like this with clay. This is glacial deposited clay at the bottom. This is peat, which is a combination of all kind of organic things up here, you know, leaves and twigs and branches and dead squirrels and stuff. And then this marl in the middle is a combination, and that's where these animals get trapped. And this particular 3-level of strata occurs in this particular part of New York State much more frequently than anywhere else, and therefore we have had dozens, scores of mastodons in Orange County that have been found. Because it favors the preservation of these. And it's kind of nice because it's a place where we're able to learn a lot about these guys. The birthplace of American vertebrate paleontology, if you ever go to Boone County, Kentucky, if you happen to be down that way, this is a wonderful place to go. It's the birthplace of vertebrate paleontology, and those are all mastodons up there. There's a lot of mastodon remains there. The environment around Boone County, Kentucky is almost identical to Orange County, and so they have wonderful preservation there as well. Now, later on, you're going to hear from Joe Devine, and later Evan Galbraith, part 2 and part 3 of this, and they're going to talk about the 200-plus year research that has gone into discovering all of this. Now, these things happened, and in Orange County, these animals lived and they died. The native people knew about them, but when the Europeans showed up, they probably were not too interested in these tremendous animals that once lived here, so probably none of those stories got passed on. You don't read too much about them in the early ethnographic accounts of Orange County. You don't think you find any of it, in fact. So it wasn't until like the early part of the 19th century when accidentally farmers in Newburgh and areas in Montgomery began to find these things in their fields, and people started asking questions about what are these bones, and all sorts of fantastic opinions started to come out about dinosaurs or beasts from the Bible that once walked the landscape here. Fantastic stories. And then scientists stepped in and said, no, these are animals that used to live here. But you'll hear the story of Charles Wilson Peale, who is right here, and that's Charles Wilson Peale right here. You'll see this again later on today. And his excavations in the early part of the 19th century. Now, we're still looking. We are still excavating in Orange County looking for more windows into the past. And this is what makes new students fall in love with the world of archaeology. It's like entering a time machine. Every time I do it, I think of this. You know, when you dig a hole in the ground that's a foot deep and you step in the hole, you're standing on a living floor that people stood on maybe 5,000 years ago. Dig that hole 3 feet deep and stand in it, and now you're standing on the living floor that Mastodons stepped on. You know, it's kind of a nice feeling. As you go deeper into the earth, you see the different cultures who lived in the area at that time, or the animals that lived here at that time. So it's kind of like opening a book. It's a little more work than reading a book, but it certainly is like that. It's really a type of discovery. This is a site in New Windsor, near Newburgh, where we found human occupation that goes back about 8,000 years ago. Not quite far back enough to see some of these fantastic extinct forms of life, but about 8,000 years ago. I take that back. This site actually went back to about 11,000 years ago. I forgot. We did find one of those projectile points that goes back probably 11,000 years ago, which meant at least one person. We found one. And in Orange County 11,000 years ago, there were probably 40 people living here, right? And so one person happened to walk through New Windsor and had a hole in his pocket, or she, and this projectile point fell out, and there it was on the ground. To give us an indication that someone walked through there that long ago. That person well could have, walking up the Moonda Creek watershed, run into one of these distinct forms of elephant. Because they were just about on their way out at that time. This was the one we did in Duchess County, the Hyde Park Mastodon in 99 and 2000. It took us 392 days to find this particular animal. Those are my students from, I was teaching at Vassar at the time. These are some of my students right here. the pelvis of this animal is the size of a dining room table. The head is the size of a refrigerator. These were big animals. I mean, it must have been amazing to live in Warwick at that time and see, herds of elephants coming down Main Street. It must have been a fantastic sight. It's hard to, you have to have a good imagination to be an archaeologist as well, by the way. Most archaeologists are children who never grew up. Because it's that same kind of feeling when you're a child, when you can almost picture anything in your mind. And oftentimes adults lose that somewhere along the line. Not any of you guys. But we excavated that bone by Young, a bone, a humerus, an ulna. And we got look at the size of this bone. And this guy's 6'4", so you can But you know, just amazing the sizes of some of these bones. It was just incredible. It's incredible. An 8-foot-long tusk. Tusks are ivory. Tusks have growth rings on them like the rings of a tree. So we were able to count the growth rings on this tusk. He was about 34 years old. And we figured from all, looking at the pelvis and a few other things, we figured it was a male. And he had a fractured skull along with tuberculosis. And males come of age, if you're a mastodon, you come of age in your early 30s. Kind of like guys, right? And, you know, you mature at age, or your early 30s. And at that point, you know, there's only one alpha male, and so we figured there was some kind of a contest going on. This guy lost because he has a fractured skull. He got depressed and he died. Tuberculosis did not help him all. This one was radiocarbon dated at about 13,000 years ago. This was where we were working in. This is marl. This is that stuff that if you stepped in there, they'd never find you again. Really, really difficult kind of excavations. Here in Orange County, you have the Warren Mastodon, discovered in 1845. You may hear more about this later. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History, definitely go up to the floor where the mastodons and mammoths are. It's a wonderful, wonderful spot. But I think you'll hear a little bit more about this guy this afternoon, too, with Joe Devine. We're still finding stuff. This is a horribly blurry photo, but here is Bob Ferratic at the New York State Museum a couple of years ago found tusks along the Wallkill River. So we're still finding things. Every spring when we plow the fields over here, we find stuff. Every time there's a flood event on the Wallkill River and a bank erodes, out pops a skull, out pops a tusk, out pops some bones. There were that many of them in Orange County that they're still popping up. This is kind of the summary of this particular piece of the talk. It's the coming together of the end of one era here in Orange County, beginning of another. About 13,000 years ago, mastodons slipped into extinction. About 12,000 years ago, they pretty much left the landscape, probably due to inability to adapt. And we arrived about 13,000 years ago, so there was an overlap. And the way of looking at this here in Orange County is that these two species were passing in the Orange County landscape. One was heading to oblivion, those were the extinct elephants, and the other was heading to dominance. All right? And the people that came here to Orange County were here, and now we're here. And so we've had this continuity of human life in Duchess County, in Orange County for about 12,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the next two presentations will be later today. We'll pick it up from all these mastodons are in the ground and how the discovery came that they were there, the rediscovery or people recognizing they were there, and what we did with all of that. And then the future of what we're going to do with what we have found. Any questions on any of this? Yes?
I've just noticed when you showed the picture of the glacier, there's no glacier up in Alaska.
Maybe the picture didn't go over far enough? No, it was there and it didn't show any glacier?
Well, it showed green up in...
Green, well, Greenland's on the east and Alaska would be out on the west.
Well, yes. It was,
okay.
It was Alaska.
Okay. There parts of Alaska just were not covered by glaciation. The question was, why wasn't Alaska fully glaciated? Just the dynamics of where the ice was coming from. Apparently, it wasn't coming so it would cover much of Alaska. The fact that Alaska was not truly ice-free, but didn't have as much ice, is what allowed, we think, the first people to migrate from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge and come down through Alaska, and then one of a couple different routes found their way into North America. It also could be that whoever made that slide forgot to put ice in Alaska. I mean, that's not, you know, yeah. But there wasn't as much ice in Alaska, and that allowed what we call an ice-free corridor for people to get here. Questions? Yes?
Well, I teach 4th grade, and we study this. And I've been looking for a couple of years for someone to come in and do this.
Where do you teach?
Goshen.
Oh, okay. Well,
And we're not allowed to go on trips.
I'll give you my email address and you can get in touch with me.
I mean, it would be
Yeah.
great to have
4th grade in New York State is local history or Native Americans. Everywhere in the state does that. And yeah, and so I could, let me know. I will come over. Yeah. Okay.